Welcome to the dark world of scary stories. A place where every sound is a premonition of the unknown, and every shadow is a step into another dimension. If you're ready to open the door to the scariest secrets, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the bell, because the scariest is yet to come. Turn on the light and let's beg. It was something far more terrifying, something no science could explain. As they tried to escape, the island grew even more malevolent. Every turn in the forest led to even more frightening visions, even greater monsters stretching out their hands to drag them into their dark depths. And those who stayed too long on the island inevitably became part of its horrifying history. What happened there remained a mystery. But one thing was certain: Poveglia Island, even when the last ships departed, never left those who set foot on it in peace. The night over the island became worse than ever before. The wind, relentless and howling, seeped into every crack of their tents, and it seemed as though it brought invisible chains that dragged people back to this place. Every sound became terrifying: the crackling of trees, the rustling of grass, and even the shadows moving without any visible source of light. Something was wrong. Something unbearably evil was enveloping this island, and its dark essence slowly drained the last remnants of strength from the people. Giovanni, who had kept his distance all this time, began to notice more. He saw one of the migrants, an old man named Antonio, start to behave strangely. At first, he simply stood there, silently staring into the darkness, as though communicating with something invisible. But then his gaze grew wilder and emptier. His eyes seemed to radiate madness, and with every passing minute, he seemed to sink deeper into a trance. The next morning, Antonio disappeared. No trace was found. Only his old shoes were left at the spot where he had stood all night, and a chilling feeling lingered that he hadn't left. He had simply vanished. But the worst part was that his disappearance wasn't an isolated event. Every day, one by one, the migrants vanished without a trace, and no one could find them. Giovanni felt that the island was alive, that it was consuming every soul that stepped onto its land. Nothing remained of these people. They became part of this horrific place, and even their names vanished, leaving only echoes of their moans in the air. All attempts to escape, whether by water or through the forest, ended the same: they could not leave this cursed island. One night, Giovanni decided to venture to the heart of the island. He felt that all that was left was to uncover the mystery of this place. He was ready for anything. He walked quietly through the forest, which seemed darker and more somber with every step. And then, when he reached the old, abandoned hospital, a terrifying building that had once been a place for those suffering from the plague, he heard a rustling, as though someone was walking behind him. But when he turned around, he saw nothing but pitch-black darkness. Climbing the stairs, Giovanni reached the place where ruthless treatment methods had once been practiced. Now it was just a twisted, abandoned structure with broken windows and overgrown walls. And when he stepped inside, it felt as though even the air here wasn't breathing normally. And suddenly, in the midst of this dreadful silence, he heard a quiet voice. Soft, barely audible, but as if calling from the depths of the darkness. "Giovanni! Giovanni! You won't go anywhere!" It wasn't a human voice. It was like a whisper from the very walls, like the island itself, demanding new victims. Giovanni desperately tried to run, but his legs grew heavy, like stone, and his vision became foggy. Every attempt to flee was in vain. The darkness literally closed off his path, as if the walls were moving and closing in around him. His heart raced, but what he saw when he lifted his head again made him momentarily forget how to breathe. He saw them. Hundreds of indistinct figures moving silently through this dreadful place. Only their faces were clearly visible: twisted features, empty eyes that glowed like tiny flames in the darkness. And they stared at him like prey, whispering softly to each other, "Another one! Another one for us!" He tried to scream, but no sound came out. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey him. The darkness around him was like glue, slowly consuming him. And then, he felt something cold and evil touch his shoulder, like a hand that had been waiting for him for a long time. His body became numb, and his consciousness slowly sank into the darkness. And the island took him, just like it had taken all the others who stepped onto its soil. They all became part of its dark soul, invisible but ever present around them. All those souls were kept in this terrible place, and no one could leave it. Thus continues the story of Poveglia Island. No one can say how many more souls have been brought to its land. But one thing remains certain: the island never let go of its guests, even when they died. And when new migrants arrive here, they already become part of the legend, part of this island, which will never leave them. Each passing day on the island grew heavier, its burden becoming more unbearable. Giovanni, though losing parts of himself in this endless terror, still hadn't entirely forgotten that he was alive. In the eyes of the remaining migrants, hopelessness grew day by day. They tried to believe that they would be freed soon, that a ship would come to take them away from this hellish place. But everyone who came to Poveglia Island had already fallen under its will. No one could explain why people started disappearing, why their gazes became vacant, and why they seemed to be swallowed up by an invisible force. This was not just a sickness, not just death. It was something far worse, much more terrifying. Giovanni was one of the last survivors among those who had arrived on the island. He wandered, searching for an escape, but every step he took only led him deeper into the labyrinth of this deadly trap. The roads on the island were familiar, but every time he turned a corner, he found himself where he had been before. The forest seemed to fold back on itself, trapped in its own darkness. One day, when Giovanni was alone, he heard a whisper. It didn't sound like human voices. This was the whisper of the island itself. He saw the trees begin to move, as though alive, lifting their branches to the sky. He stopped, trying to comprehend this ominous phenomenon. And then he saw it. In one of the windows of the old hospital, something reflected what looked like a face. This face wasn't human. It was twisted, with contorted features, and its eyes were empty, yet they stared at him. And from the other side of the window, in the darkness, a voice called out again, this time speaking his name. Giovanni, turn back. You cannot escape. You cannot leave us. It was like an incantation that paralyzed him. His legs wouldn't obey, but his mind screamed that he needed to leave, that he needed to stop this nightmare. But every time he tried to move, something stopped him. It was as if the island needed only one glance, one sigh to keep him in its grip. And then, at the moment of his despair, Giovanni noticed something at the bottom of the lake. He lifted his head, watching as the surface of the water began to tremble. And then, in an instant, figures rose from the depths. Not people, not creatures of flesh and blood, but terrifying ghosts, or perhaps the souls of those who had died here. Their faces were indistinguishable, merging into a single mass of shadows that moved across the water, and from their mouths came only invisible screams. Giovanni couldn't believe his eyes, but these were the same souls that had wandered here for decades, seeking salvation but never receiving it. The souls began to move closer to him, and with each movement, his fear grew. They didn't walk, they swam. They filled the water, and with every movement, they left behind a sinister trace. And when they were almost upon him, Giovanni felt them touch him, not physically, but energetically, like a shadow filling his body. You are one of us, they whispered. You cannot leave. Giovanni felt his soul begin to unravel. He felt the darkness consuming him from within, as every memory began to dissolve and turn into emptiness. His heart would beat for a little while longer, but his consciousness was fading, becoming part of the island. And just as it had happened to everyone before him, he became a part of the terrible, merciless cycle that endlessly repeated on Poveglia Island. Meanwhile, the other migrants who were still alive became more and more part of this nightmare. Their gazes became as empty as the others, their bodies losing all vitality. They wandered like zombies, heads lowered, until they disappeared into the darkness. And then, at last, when it seemed that no one remained to remember this island, a new ship appeared on the water. It was another stream of migrants, seeking a new life in America. And though they were headed for the island station, the air already felt heavy with something evil. The island began to stir with its dark energy, preparing another wave for those who would step onto its threshold. Everyone who arrived became a new part of this cursed land. And so, anyone who touched Poveglia would never leave this place alive. Giovanni felt the darkness of this place consume every breath he took. The trees surrounding the hospital no longer simply stood, they seemed to listen to his thoughts. As soon as he took a step, they moved, as if gripped by some invisible force, ready to tear him apart. But what terrified him the most was that even the air on the island felt alive. His skin could sense how it tightened with each breath, as though the very atmosphere of this desolate land was squeezing him. Each inhalation was heavy, like a stone lodged in his chest. And then, at the very moment when he tried to find an escape, something very cold touched his back. He spun around sharply, but there was nothing before him, just the wild wind tearing through the forest and hitting his face. His heart nearly stopped when he heard a whisper in his ears. "You won't escape, Giovanni. You can't leave us." These words didn't sound like an ominous voice. It was the island itself, speaking through every leaf, every gust of wind. Giovanni didn't know whether this was real or if he had already lost his mind. But what he saw next became an even worse nightmare than he could have imagined. Finding the old ruined walls of the hospital, he stepped inside the decayed building, once the site of horrific experiments on the sick. Everything here had been abandoned, but the strange energy of the place still pulsed with life. And as he crossed the threshold, a scene suddenly unfolded before him that made him hold his breath. On the floor lay old bodies, covered in mold. They weren't just dead. Their eyes were wide open, but there was nothing in them, just emptiness. And then one of them, an old man with a disfigured face, opened his eyes. Giovanni could hardly believe what he saw as the man began to slowly rise, not standing, but crawling as if guided by some invisible force. His body was contorted, the bones barely holding together, and dark, rotting wounds oozed from his skin. His mouth was filled with black liquid that dripped like poison, and a horrific stench of decaying flesh filled the air. But the most terrifying thing was that his gaze was fixed directly on Giovanni, and in it there was neither fear nor pain, only emptiness and one question: "Why are you still alive?" And as soon as he spoke, his body crumbled into pieces, transforming into a hellish liquid that spread across the floor, absorbing every gust of wind, every sound. Giovanni couldn't breathe. He felt the darkness filling every corner of his body. Then once again he heard, "You are becoming one of us. You are part of us." And suddenly, the darkness began to move. At first, it was a soft rustling, then a loud swaying, as if the whole place was changing shape. The island was not just land. It was alive. It breathed, it devoured, and now, it was taking Giovanni back to the beginning. Each step he took led him back to the hospital, to the place where he had stood and witnessed those horrific transformations. The feeling of unreality made him run again. He ran without looking back, without thinking about where he was going. He ran straight into the darkness, into the very heart of this nightmare. And then, when he reached the edge of the island, where the water crashed against the rocks, and it seemed like he might escape, he heard it. It was a voice. Not a single face, not one ghost. It was a chorus, echoing in his head for the rest of his days. The voices of thousands who had died, their screams and moans. They could not die. They could not be forgotten. And then, Giovanni felt a hand grip his throat. His legs could no longer move, and before him appeared a massive black shadow, something more than just a creature. It was something non-existent, something without a face or form. And he understood that his soul was no longer his own. It had become part of the island. He felt the darkness seep into his heart, as everything he had loved, everything he had known, turned into emptiness. The island left him no chance. It consumed him completely. And this happened to every soul who stepped onto this land. Now, when new people arrived, they no longer saw the island's terrifying features. They didn't see how it lived, how it devoured those trying to escape. They were just part of the endless cycle. And this cycle went on again, and again, and again. The island was alive. And the more Giovanni felt this truth, the deeper the shadow penetrated his soul. Nothing in the world could help him escape, and just when he lost all hope, it began to seem that the island itself started to change. Ideas, thoughts, fears, everything intertwined, as though the island itself was starting to shape its own reality. The world was not ruled by humans. No, it was ruled by those who had long since died but had not found peace. Those who couldn't leave this island. And now they ruled here, pulling new victims with every ship that docked. Sometimes Giovanni saw them. They began appearing as shadows among the old walls. Though they were only memories of those who had failed to leave this hellish island, these shadows became more real than anything he had ever seen. They followed him, though they couldn't touch his body. They could only whisper his name, again and again. It was like an incantation that wouldn't let him break the connection to the island. Giovanni felt his mind slowly breaking apart. It wasn't just what he saw, it was what he heard. These voices shattered his perception of reality. And then, one evening, when the darkness became thickest, Giovanni awoke in his room in the hospital. His consciousness wandered between sleep and reality. And suddenly, he heard footsteps. This was not the same as before. It wasn't just the wind or the sound of water. These were footsteps, the approach of something alive. Something was coming closer to his bed. Giovanni felt cold sweat cover his body, and as he turned his head, he saw a figure in the doorway. It was a man. His face was covered with a mask made of cracked skin, and his eyes, they were empty, black, as if he were alive, but without a soul. And as he took a step forward, black liquid began to ooze from beneath the mask, flowing over his skin, covering it. The sensation of this creature approaching was unbearable. "You cannot leave us," came the cold voice. Giovanni rushed toward the door, but he felt his legs betray him. They didn't move, unable to break free from the influence that the island had over him. The shadow of this creature was getting closer to his face. He felt how the darkness was consuming him more and more. And then it became even worse. When the mask was removed, Giovanni realized that there was no living face underneath. This was not just a dead man, it was his own face. He saw himself. The same features, but with some unspeakable horror, expressed in the empty eyes and the horrific scar that crossed his lips. The man's body slowly decayed, and black liquid poured from it, resembling a deadly virus that devoured all life. And what was even more terrifying, this was not just the liquid oozing from decaying bodies. This was the very essence of Giovanni's fears, all his terrors, his guilt, which weighed on him like a heavy burden. The island began to devour him not just physically, but emotionally. He was no longer just a victim. Now he had become part of the same horror, part of this cursed cycle that would never end. For the second time, when he tried to escape, he found himself in the same place where they had first placed him, in front of the old hospital building. Again, every step he took led him back to the beginning. The island was eternal and endless. And then new shadows began to appear. These were not just the dead, but also new victims, those who arrived on the island. Giovanni saw their bodies. They became part of the island. Their eyes were empty, their bodies lost. Their souls no longer belonged to them. They wandered in the mist, crawling on the ground, searching for a way to the very hell they had created. The island didn't just feed on death. It fed on fear, despair, and the loss of hope. And the more time Giovanni spent on the island, the more he himself became part of this unstoppable darkness. His eyes no longer saw the world. He couldn't breathe without feeling the emptiness spreading in his chest. With each passing moment, he became less and less alive. His soul was being consumed more and more by the island. And then, when he was nothing but a body moving without consciousness, he realized the island had already taken him. He was no longer a person. Now he was only part of that dark, eternal nightmare that would never cease. And so, he remained among the others, among those who could no longer say their name, among those who would forever remain in the darkness of Poveglia. The island was no longer just a place. It had become a living nightmare, closing off every possible exit, locking the doors to any hope. But despite how Giovanni felt as part of this dreadful mechanism, something even more profound began to infiltrate his consciousness. The more he tried to escape, the more the island was ruled by the very dead souls he encountered. Their shadows were no longer just deep terrors. They had become phantoms, walking behind him, haunting every step he took. And every glance they cast felt like a cold needle piercing his heart. One time, when Giovanni tried to sneak through the old hospital's underground passages, he thought he heard a whisper. It was a voice, but he couldn't make out what it was saying. Everything around him seemed to become misty, blurry, like his own thoughts. Then suddenly, at one of the turns, he saw an unusual reflection in a puddle of water. It was him, but his reflection's eyes were empty, like the man with the mask. His mouth was open, and black liquid poured out, resembling poison. But this wasn't just a reflection. It was his own image, trying to pull him into the darkness. "Stay with me," the reflection whispered. The voice wasn't just terrifying. It was the voice of his fear. It was his reflection, delving into the depths of his own terrors, absorbing everything he felt, and beginning to recreate his fears. Giovanni ran back but heard footsteps behind him. The shadows were getting even closer. His heart almost stopped from anxiety. He knew that this was no longer just fear, but the very essence of the island, which multiplied its horrors with every shadow. Regaining some strength, he headed towards the old lighthouse at the island's edge, hoping to find a way out. But along the way, he stumbled upon a strange object buried in dense thickets. It was an old bell. Covered in mud and moss, it still emitted dull sounds, as if an invisible hand was gradually pressing on it. This was the place where the plague victims were buried, and the bell perhaps testified to the fact that even now the dead had not left this place. He approached it, but as soon as he touched it, the bell suddenly fell silent and began emitting thick black smoke. At first, Giovanni couldn't understand what was happening. But this smoke, it started to form moving figures. They were not just ghosts, they were the shadows of people who had died here centuries ago. Their disfigured, blackened forms began moving around him, whispering over and over, "You are ours. You are one of us." Giovanni lost his bearings. He felt how, with every movement of this black smoke, his body began absorbing part of the horror already on the island. The more he breathed, the more he felt his heart stopping, as if he were becoming one of them. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't escape this. Suddenly, a man emerged from the smoke. He was neither dead nor alive. His face was covered with wounds, his clothes torn, and his gaze was empty. This was the same man he had seen earlier in the hospital. He began to slowly approach, and Giovanni felt his legs unable to move, as if he had become part of this horrifying vision. "You came here to take everything we left behind. But now we take you," the man whispered, and his hands slowly began to pull Giovanni into the darkness. But suddenly, as the darkness was about to engulf him completely, he saw yet another reflection, in the flowing water beside him. It was a woman's face. She looked like an ordinary person, with a slight expression of fear on her face. She reached out to him and said, "Don't run, Giovanni. We want you to be with us. All of us." And then Giovanni understood that there was no escape. The island didn't just consume souls. It turned them into part of itself. He saw people he had once known, saw them here, dead, but now they had become part of the same cycle. They could no longer break free. And in the end, he understood he had become one of them. They all became part of the island. Now, his voice, his gaze, his consciousness were woven into the darkness of this place. And though Giovanni could no longer go back, he knew the island would never stop claiming new victims. And what he had experienced was only one of the countless nightmares that befell every new arrival. They all became part of it, and it would always be so. The island was worse than any nightmare because nightmares, at least, had an end. But here, on this cursed land, there was no end. There was only an endless cycle of pain, loss, and fear. Giovanni felt his mind breaking under the weight of the terrifying, inexplicable things happening around him. More and more, he felt his body and soul becoming part of this island, with each passing day leaving less and less of his former self. He saw how the other victims slowly began to resemble the very phantoms that surrounded him. Faces without eyes, hands that couldn't pull him away from this horrifying reality. Every step, every movement around him felt as meaningless as his life, which no longer held any purpose. The island had become his curse, his prison. He wandered the dark corridors of the hospital when he encountered the same figure again. The man with the mask, whose presence had now become an inseparable part of his own soul. His eyes were empty, and each time Giovanni tried to look into them, he felt his mind begin to shatter into pieces. "You won't leave here," the man whispered softly, but this time his voice was calm, like a quiet song sung by death itself. Giovanni could bear no more. He could already feel the islands of his mind slowly crumbling, like a cracked mask that could no longer be restored. There was no hope anymore. There was no escape. If he were to move again, each step would grow heavier. He felt death drawing nearer with every breath, as his spirit had already been claimed by the island. He was no longer alive. He was just a form, a body that remained here. And then Giovanni understood. To stop this endless pain, he had only one choice. Using all his remaining strength, he found what he had been searching for. It was an old, rusted axe, hanging on the wall of the hospital, among the remnants of broken furniture and shattered glass. He grabbed it, and although his hands no longer obeyed him, although his mind was on the verge of disintegrating into pieces, he still held it. With a face more shadow than living, Giovanni raised the axe. He gathered all that remained of him as a person, and with one swift motion, he ended his suffering. His last thought, before his body sank completely into the darkness, was simple yet terrifying. This is not the end. The island would never stop searching for new victims. It eternally claims those who step foot on its land. And Giovanni's death was just another cycle, one of the many horrific endings for those who settled on Poveglia. And so, as his soul began to dissolve into the darkness, the island, which was no longer just a place but an entity, Giovanni understood. This island gives no escape. It turns everyone into part of itself. All who come to it become its shadows, its pieces. And now Giovanni was one of those who would always be part of this cursed place. And the island claims them all, over and over again. And so, as darkness once again envelopes you, we say goodbye, but not for long. Remember, the night is never truly safe. Subscribe so you don't miss the new horrors, and come back when it's time for new nightmares. Beware of the shadows. They are always near. Until next time.